I'll just get it going. I'm just waiting for the stream to begin. Right now, we're just waiting for. I'm just sitting here waiting for the live stream to actually commence. Because I set up the recording for 12:30, so I will wait. Yeah. We got less than a minute to go. And then we will get into this. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just waiting. I've never done where I set things up ahead of time to do a live stream. I know how to do a live stream, but I've never set up a certain time. See how this goes. Yeah, so I'm just waiting. It says, okay, well, let's begin streaming. Hello. Well, I told you I'm going to be doing a whole thing today on Lincoln. I'm just waiting for it to begin. What? What the hell happened? Oh, god damn it. Okay. It says, what the hell's going on? I have no idea. I'm still trying to figure this shit out. Okay. Yeah. I'm just waiting for something happened. I thought I was going straight. So I don't know what's going on. Okay. Something's happened. I have no idea what happened. Okay, something's happened. Okay, well, let's see if this is working. God damn it. I don't know what happened. Stop streaming. Fucking hell. I don't know what's going on. Let me figure this shit out. What the fuck happened? I'm just gonna delete this thing. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Let's get back to this. What the hell is going on? Okay. Is it going live? I'm just waiting for... Okay, I guess. What the hell is going... Okay, let's see if that's working. Okay, I want to talk about this. I had a little problem with an issue at first with live streaming this. So, yeah, I wanted to do this live stream about the truth about Lincoln. And it really started with Razor Fist. I was watching one of his, and he kept talking about how Lincoln was an actual tyrant, and so I started looking into it, and I found that it is true. The terrible truth about Lincoln and the Confederate War. I mean, I have a bunch of things about this that I wanted to go through, but this really does talk, about who Lincoln happened to be. President Lincoln has been all but defied in America with a godlike giant statue at a Parthenon-like memorial in Washington. Generations of school children have been indoctrinated with the story of the Honest Abe, which, by the way, he's the one that actually created this narrative. Lincoln is a national hero who saved the Union and fought a noble war to end slavery, and that the evil Southern states seceded from the Union to protect slavery. This is the Yankee myth of history, written and promulgated by Northerns, and it is a complete falsity. It was produced and entrenched in the culture in large part to gloss over the terrible war crimes committed by Union soldiers in the war between the states, as well as Lincoln's violations of the law, his shred in the Constitution, and other reprehensible acts. It has been very effective in keeping the average American ignorant of the real cause of the Civil War and the real nature, character, and record of Lincoln. Let us look at some unpleasant facts. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln stated clearly that 1, he had no legal authority to interfere with slavery where it existed. 2, that he had no inclination or intention to do so, even if he had the legal authority. 3, he would enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, returning runaway slaves escaping to the North to their masters in the South. And 4, that he fully supported the 13th Amendment then being debated in Congress, which would protect slavery in perpetuity and was I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. He later famously stated, "Do not paint me with the abolitionist brush." Although there was some opposition to slavery in the country, the government was willing to concede everything to the South wanted regarding slavery to keep it in the Union. Given all these facts, the idea that the South seceded to protect slavery is as absurd as the idea that Lincoln fought the war to end slavery. Lincoln himself said in a famous letter after the war began that his sole purpose was to save the Union and not to either save or end slavery. That if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, nothing could be clearer. He would never have ended slavery. For decades before the war, the South, through harsh tariffs, had been supplying about 85% of the country's revenue, nearly all of which was being spent in the North to boost its economy. Building manufacturing, infrastructure, railroads, canals, etc. With the passage of the 47% Morrill tariff, the final nail was in the coffin. The South did not secede to protect slavery, although certainly they wished to protect it. They seceded over a dispute about unfair taxation, an oppressive federal government, and the right to separate from the oppression and be governed by consent. Exactly the same issues over which the founding fathers fought the Revolutionary War. When a member of Lincoln's cabinet suggested he let the South go in peace, Lincoln famously replied, "Let the South go? Where? Then would we get our revenue?" He then launched a brutal empirical war to keep the free and sovereign states by force of arms in the Union they had created and voluntarily joined, and then voluntarily left. This began his reign of terror. Lincoln was the greatest tyrant despot in American history. In the first 4 months of his presidency, he created a complete military dictatorship, destroyed the Constitution, ended forever the constitutional republic which the Founding Fathers instituted, committed horrendous crimes against civilian citizens, and formed the tyrannical, overbearing, and oppressive federal government, which the American people suffer under to this day. In his first 4 months, he, one, failed to call Congress into session after the South fired upon Fort Sumter in direct violation of the Constitution, called up an army of 75,000 men, bypassing the congressional authority in direct violation of the Constitution. 3. Unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus, a function of Congress violating the Constitution. This gave him the power, as he saw it, to arrest civilians without charge and imprison them indefinitely without trial, which he did. Ignored the Supreme Court order to restore the rights of habeas corpus, thus violating the Constitution again and ignoring the separation of powers which the founders put in place exactly for the purpose of preventing one man's using tyrannical powers in the executive. When the Chief Justice forwarded a copy of the Supreme Court's decision to Lincoln, he wrote out an order for the arrest of the Chief Justice and gave it to the U.S. Marshals Force expedition in violation of the Constitution. He is a tyrant. Unilaterally ordered the naval blockade of the southern ports, an act of war, and a responsibility of Congress, a violation of the Constitution. Commandeered and closed over 300 newspapers in the North because of the editorials against his war policy and his illegal military invasion of the South. This clearly violated the First Amendment and freedom of speech and the press. Sent in army forces destroyed the printing presses and other machinery at those newspapers, violation of the Constitution. Arrested the publishers and editors and owners of those papers and imprisoned them without charge and without trial for the remainder of the war. All in direct violation of both the Constitution and the Supreme Court order aforementioned. Arrested and imprisoned without charge or trial another 15,000 to 20,000 U.S. citizens who dared to speak out against the war, his policies, or were suspected of anti-war feelings. Relative to the population at the time, he would be equivalent to President George W. Bush, arrested and imprisoned roughly 150,000 to 200,000 Americans without trial for disagreeing with the Iraq War. Can you imagine? Sent the army to arrest the entire legislator of Maryland to keep them from meeting legally because they were debating a bill of secession. They were all imprisoned without charge or trial in direct violation of the Constitution. Unilaterally created the state of West Virginia in direct violation of the Constitution. He's a tyrant. Sent 350,000 northern men to their deaths to kill 350,000 southern men in order to force the free and sovereign states of the South to remain in the Union they, the people, legally voted to peacefully withdraw from, all in order to continue the South's revenue flow into the North. Yep. You get this? Oh, I'm not done. These are just a few of the most egregious things Lincoln did during his despotic presidency. He set up as a tyrannical dictator with powers never before utilized or even imagined by any previous administration or after. Not even this current administration is as evil as this fucker. During this 4 years of terrible war, he was one of the greatest despots the world has ever known. His tyranny focused against his own countrymen, both North and South. He was called a despot and a tyrant by many newspapers and citizens, both North and South, until he had imprisoned nearly all those who dared to simply speak out against his unconstitutional usurpation of power. I think that's how you pronounce that. Those who disagreed with him were branded as traitors, just as were the brave and honorable men in the states which had legally seceded from the Union over just such issues as these criminal abuse of powers by the federal government. 4 months after Fort Sumter, when Lincoln finally called Congress back into session, no one dared oppose anything he wanted or speak out against him for fear of imprisonment. So completely had he entrenched his unilateral power and silenced his other many critics. The Union Army under General Grant, Sheridan, and President Lincoln committed active genocide against Southern citizens. This is difficult for some to believe, but is explicit in their writings and dispatches at the time, and indisputable in their actions. Tens of thousands of Southern men, women, and children, civilians, white, black, slave, and free alike, were shot, hanged, raped, imprisoned without trial, their homes, lands, and possessions stolen, pillaged, and burned in one of the most horrific and brutal genocides ever inflicted upon a people anywhere. But the Yankee myth of a history is silent in these well-documented matters. For an excellent expose of these war crimes and their terrible extent, see War Crimes Against Southern Civilians by Walter Bryan Cisco. After the Union had suffered 2 years of crushing defeats in battle, did Lincoln resolve to emancipate the slaves, and only as a war measure, a military tactic, not for moral or humanitarian purpose. He admitted this, remarking, "We must change tactics or lose the game." He was hoping, as his original draft of the document shows, that a slave uprising would occur, making it harder for Southerners to continue the war. His only interest in freeing the slaves was in forcing the South to remain in the Union. His Emancipation Proclamation was denounced by Northerns, Southerns, and Europeans alike for its absurdity and hypocrisy. For it only freed the slaves in the seceded states where he could not reach them, and kept slavery intact in the North and the border states, where he could have freed them at any time. The Gettysburg Address, the most famous speech in American history, is an absurd piece of war rhetoric and poetic and poetry of lies. We were not engaged in a great civil war to see whether the that nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. The South was engaged in a war of independence from a tyrannical North, and after having legally seceded, wished only to be let alone. The North was engaged in a war of empire to keep the South involuntarily under its yoke. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not have perished from the earth. Had the North lost the war, on the contrary, it perished in the United States when the North won the war. For freely representative government by consent of the governor is exactly what the South was fighting for, and exactly what Lincoln's military victory destroyed. The checks and balances of power, the separation of power, the constitutional constraints, so carefully deliberately put into place by the Founding Fathers, had all been destroyed in Lincoln's first months. The republic which the founders gave us had been completely destroyed, and a new nation state was set up, one in which the free and sovereign states would afterwards be only vassals and tributaries, slaves to an all-powerful, oppressive federal government. This new nation state is completely different in both nature and consequence to the original American Republic. One only has to look around today to see the end result of a legacy of Lincoln's war, his destruction of freedom and his institution of despotic, centralized governmental power and tyranny. In retrospect, it is a tragedy that John Wilkes Booth did not act 4 years earlier. Slavery would have ended naturally, as it has already elsewhere, except for in Africa and Arab states. The American Republic, literally, and 700,000 lives would have been saved, and untold thousands of those young men would have lived to contribute their God, I'm terrible at certain words. I can't pronounce it. Inventions, creativity, and talents to the political, economic, literally, scientific, and social legacy of our people. And the greatest despotic tyrant in American history would never have gained the foothold of power or have been able to establish the oppressive and omnipotent federal government as we all suffer under today. Yeah. 18 thoughts on the terrible truth about Lincoln and the Civil War. Yeah. This is just one thing. But you see it. And these are the war crimes. I can go into that, and I will. But here's another. This was actually from, let me bring you up this, so if you're looking for it, it's called From the Trenches World Report. Yeah. .com. That's where you can go to find this about Lincoln. Here's Semper. Yeah, and this talks about the Semper Tyrannis, 31 of the top reasons why Lincoln was a tyrant. Semper Tyrannis. These words, shouted by John Wilkes Booth immediately after he shot President Lincoln at Ford's Theater in D.C. at the close of the Civil War, have seldom been pondered upon, interpreted. Semper Tyrannis means thus always to the tyrants. Exactly why John Wilkes Booth considered Lincoln a tyrant. Several modern-day books have attempted to reveal who the real Lincoln really was. Despite the liberal revisionist views of portraying Lincoln as a savior comparable to Christ, has been discovered by in-depth research proves revealing otherwise. With the restrictions in this forum, we will suffice to compile a simple list showing what John Wilkes Booth observed in President Lincoln that could qualify him to to actually be a tyrant. 1. And there's 31 of them. In March 1861, before the start of the Civil War, a peace commission with ex-president John Tyler as a member traveled to D.C. in hopes of avoiding war. Lincoln refused to meet with them. The Southerners offered to pay for all federal property on Southern soil, as well as southern portion of the national debt. Napoleon III of France offered to mediate the dispute, but was also rebuffed by Lincoln. 2. It was known that Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, was to be abandoned, but Lincoln had the federal garrison ordered from a nearby fort into Fort Sumter. During negotiations with South Carolina, Lincoln broke the truce by ordering federal gunboats to resupply the fort. Lincoln saw an opportunity to inaugurate civil war without appearing as an aggressor by the maneuvering the South to fire the first shot. Below and to the left is an image of John Wilkes Booth. 3. Lincoln started the war without the consent of Congress. 4. Lincoln sent a request to all governors of non-ceding states to send military troops in order to unconstitutionally invade their sister states by coercing them into submission. Lincoln's reason was to march troops of one state into another in order to do his will. Lincoln ignored the fact that the Union was formed by the voluntary agreement of these states and that they did not surrender their sovereignty by uniting together. True. 5. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, jailing anyone who differed from his opinion and keeping them locked up for the duration of the war without the benefit of attorney or having any charges brought up against them, denying them a trial by jury. 6. Lincoln ignored the decisions of the Supreme Court when they ruled against his policies and wrote out a warrant for the arrest of Chief Justice Robert Taney when he ruled against Lincoln's unconstitutional actions. 7. Lincoln imposed military rule on parts of the South that became conquered territory during the war. Lincoln supported a confiscation act that allowed the federal army to plunder private property as they went. 9. Lincoln authorized the billeting of the federal soldiers into private properties in the South in areas that were under military occupation. 10. Lincoln authorized a naval blockade of the southern ports, even though he never referred to the Confederacy as a foreign power. The Constitution permits such blockades only in time of war with a foreign power. 11. During the war, when parts of the southern states were under military occupation and the citizens there had no voting rights in the Union, they were nevertheless taxed severely, with the military using the most drastic tax collection measures. Lincoln did not hesitate for a moment to impose a regime of taxation without representation on the occupied South. 12. The Southern men were executed for refusing to take a loyalty oath to the Lincoln government, while many others were imprisoned. 13. Freedom of religion was denied as churches and pastors were compelled to pray from their pulpits for the success of the Union and for the President of the United States, or else The pastors were imprisoned and their churches closed or burned to the ground. 14. Lincoln denied all secessionists and peace advocates. He declared all secessionists and peace advocates to be traitors who were undeserving of the protections of federal laws. 15. Lincoln permitted over 350 northern newspapers be shut down and their buildings and their presses destroyed simply for editorializing in favor of ending the war. By September 1861, all opposition newspapers in New York were censored with the help of military force. Secretary of War William H. Seward used his secret police to scour the countryside for any editors that did not support the Lincoln administration's war policy. 16. Lincoln deported Congressman Clement L. Oh, dear God, I may get this wrong. Vallandigham, something like that, after he opposed Lincoln's income tax proposal during a Democratic Party rally in Ohio. Oh my God. Vallandigham, I'm sorry if I butchered it, was a loyal Unionist, and after being deported south, made his way to Canada, living there until the war was over. 17. Lincoln condemned land railroads were taken over. Private homes were commandeered, banks were shut down, priests and ministers were imprisoned, and property confiscated. 18. Lincoln authorized the enlistment of foreign troops, non-citizens who did not know the English language and had to be commanded by foreign-speaking officers. Didn't know that. 19. Lincoln abandoned the accepted rules of war and authorized total war on the South, directing his army against the civilian population, not only against the armed forces and organizations, the first such act in history, purposely destroying all property and life possible in the South, making them unable to rebuild any semblance of their former way of life. 20. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in which only abolished slavery in the South, territories that federal troops had no control over. It was Lincoln's real intention that his proclamation would encourage slave revolt in the South, causing havoc behind the Southern lines and forcing Confederate troops out of the field to protect their families. Lincoln's proclamation did not free a single slave. This is true. 21. Lincoln authorized the use of total war by allowing his generals to plunder the South in an orgy of pillaging, burning, executing civilians, and terrorizing communities unlike any other in the annals of history. 22. Lincoln threatened to prosecute state judges who allowed criminal prosecutions of government officials to go forward. 23. Lincoln oppressed secession when it suited him, but allowed the secession of West Virginia to set up a puppet government to carry out his will. Neither the president nor Congress had the constitutional authority to create a new state. That's right. 24. In order to suppress the freedom of the press, Lincoln ordered the Postmaster General to deny newspapers mail delivery to those that differed with his opinions, resulting in forcing the papers out of circulation. When the editors hired private messengers to deliver their papers, Lincoln ordered federal marshals to confiscate the papers, forcing them into bankruptcy. 25. While Missouri was still part of the Union and a sovereign state, Lincoln had the legally elected governor chased out of the state at the point of bayonet and installed a provisional government that supported his policies. Let's get rid of this. 26. By September 1861, Lincoln had Maryland under complete military occupation in order to keep its legislature from being allowed to vote on secession or to remain neutral. Benjamin Butler threatened to bombard Annapolis if the legislature met there. When they attempted to meet elsewhere, Lincoln had the legislators arrested and held without due process. Election judges were ordered to disallow any votes for candidates opposed to Lincoln's war. 27. It is estimated that Lincoln had over 13,000 political prisoners held in military prisons. 28. Lincoln's war in the South was a determined move to inexorably change the balance of power by abolishing the supremacy of state rights from checking uncontrolled federal expansion and power. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison both wrote that the federal union is a voluntary association of states, and if the central government goes too far, each state has the right to unilaterally to nullify that law. 29. Lincoln destroyed the idea of the union as a voluntary association of states by forcing the southern states to remain in the union at gunpoint. This is true. 30. Lincoln censored all telegraph communication. 31. Lincoln ordered the confiscation of all firearms in violation of the Second Amendment. Suffice to say, the above is a list is only a portion of the unconstitutional actions taken by Lincoln during the Civil War. Let the reader be unchained by political correctness and decide for themselves whether to believe whitewashed myths rather than the historical truth. The article submitted by Paul R. Peterson, author of you can look at that. But yeah, there's another one. Here's Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant. This is DTSS. This is the site. And basically they go through the same thing, how Lincoln basically abused his powers. I wanted to show this to you. I'll go through this too, but this whole thing showed what a tyrant he really was. For all the myths, no, like it said, he did not free one slave. Abraham was a tyrant, is remembered as the greatest president in history, although he authorized the Emancipation Proclamation, he overstepped his bounds. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the greatest president in history. Many historians believe he saved the nation in a time when it was most needed. Some believe he would have continued to act in the tyrannical way in which he did during the Civil War. Were his actions warranted? Did he need to do everything he did in order to keep the nation from disintegrate? I am bad at pronouncing certain words, sorry. Or was he trying to put a positive spin on a bad situation? It's easy to see why he was so highly regarded. Only, after all, the nation did survive a situation in which many countries have not. However, the way in which he did so is considered somewhat questionable. In order to help states fulfill the requested quotas faster, he instituted a draft for every able-bodied man between the age of 20 to 45. He did not want to go. If he did not want to go, there were the options of either finding a substitute or paying the government $300. His suspension of habeas corpus meant people would indefinitely be detained without being charged. Anyone could be jailed for just disagreeing with the local authority, civil or military, and often were. Congress was supposed to control military spending, yet Lincoln took that over. In many ways, Lincoln essentially spat on the Constitution. Many people do believe that the ends justify the means, tyrannically clearing Abraham Lincoln of any wrongdoing during and prior to the war. If that was true, then Bush should be forgiven for all the transgressions during the War on Terror. So far, history has not been kind to Bush. Yeah. The Emancipation, perhaps Abraham Lincoln's only legitimate justified act was the Emancipation Proclamation. He signed the bill into law in April 1862, abolishing slavery within the limits of the Washington, D.C. Lincoln did not really have the power to legally free the slaves, but he did so under the power of a military decree. This only affected states that had seceded from the Union. To ensure the legality of his actions, he pressed for a constitutional amendment later to be the 13th. Didn't actually free one fucking slave, as it said in the means to the end. Abraham Lincoln acted in ways in which no other president has until modern times. He ignored the Constitution, abused civil liberties throughout the majority of his time in office. He justified his actions by interpreting one of the duties given the president in the Constitution. The Constitution made him the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and protector of the Union. Since the states leaving the Union were in essence destroying it, he took that as his justification to do whatever was needed in order to keep the Union together. Yeah, he abused his power. Then we go to this. This is from LouRockwell.com. Yeah. See, everyone says he's a great president. The narrative not only infused heavily with liberal bias, but moreover, as you can see, they all think he's such a great guy. Moreover, it is entirely wrong. Far too many Americans, both current students and adults, believe that the Civil War was a war about slavery. This liberalized version of history does not chronicle the political shenanigans that were undertaken by groups to harden their centralized federal grasp on power. As it is still the case today, most Americans do not believe that this issue was at play during Abraham's era, but they are so very wrong. The current political atmosphere in America is a testament to how ignorance of history forces a people to repeat it. Abraham Lincoln should not be revered as a hollowed figure. Honest Abe was a mere man, one who made mistakes and decisions based on his own self-interest. Some of his choices did benefit America, but the benefits were often a positive byproduct of his political self-interest, not benevolence, Yeah, Abraham Lincoln's flopping stance on slavery. Time to buy old... Okay. The Republicans of the time, who eventually touted Lincoln as the champion of freedom, steadfastly demanded the media and citizens not paint him with a abolitionist brush. He even said this himself. He wasn't an abolitionist. During his first inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln did not wish to be known as anti-slavery after putting his hands on the Bible and taking the oath of office. Also, during his first inaugural address, Lincoln declared that he had absolutely no legal authority to interfere with the practice of slavery in states where it already existed. He then went on to boldly say that he would be enforcing the Fugitive Act, the federal law mandating the return of runaway slaves who had fled slave states to seek safety and freedom, which they didn't, because the North still had their slaves. Yep, although the history and textbooks tend to gloss over such facts, slavery did once exist in the North. The practice of owning beings had ended throughout the North states by 1804. Even after slavery was abolished in the North, radical discrimination still heavily existed in workplaces, schools, and communities. The idea of a little white girl sitting next to a little black girl, or a black man, or a white woman courting, was still not accepted by the tolerant North or free-loving. Actually, they didn't quite abolish, because Lincoln actually said northern states can keep their slaves. So no, they didn't actually abolish slavery. Who were hurling hateful rhetoric towards the South. Meanwhile, the indentured servitude in the North, which was a big step, but not a leap up from slavery, remained legal. Equally legal was the use of children as the North virtual slave labor inside its factories, many of whom were worked to death and usually had a poor quality of life than the average Southern slave. Politics, money, and power were just as intrinsically woven during the 1860s as are today. Some of the most fervent verbal anti-slavery Northerns who pushed for an end to slavery were not doing it entirely from a human rights statement. Many wealthy businessmen in the North were pressuring politicians to force the South into submission over slavery because they felt that it created unfair competition in the marketplace. With slavery existing in the southern states, Northern businessmen were being forced to compete against free labor. Even child labor had to be paid something. After all, Congress was fiercely divided over the issue of slavery during the months prior to the election of Lincoln. Heated arguments over the 13th Amendment, which, by the way, did not actually free slavery, did not abolish slavery. The furious debate continued during the early stage of Lincoln's presidency. The 13th Amendment that most Americans associate with Abraham Lincoln was passed at the end of the Civil War in 1865. However, there was a previous version of the 13th Amendment that had a polar opposite intent. Lincoln publicly supported the former version during his swearing-in ceremony. This original version of the 13th Amendment was meant to enshrine the practice of slavery as immutable. It would have amended the Constitution to proactively prevent any further future legislature from ever attempting to outlaw the ownership of human beings. This version of what would become the 13th Amendment if it had passed, is now often referred to as the Corwin Amendment. Thomas Corwin, Ohio Republican representative and a Lincoln supporter, sponsored the bill. I had no objections to it being made, expressed, and invoked. Lincoln said when referring to Corwin's proposal, according to a report by Constitution Daily. The political landscape before Lincoln's election. To truly understand what actually caused the Civil War and Lincoln's massive flip-flop on slavery, we must understand what happened during the 10 years that led up to his election, and the split in the Democratic Party, which occurred at its convention to select a presidential candidate to oppose the Republicans. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. This law permitted each new state coming into the United States to decide for itself whether or not slavery would be legal inside its borders. It was sponsored by the wing of the Republican to which Lincoln belonged. The legislation overturned the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which had banned slavery north of Maryland's southern border. This delineation is commonly known as the Mason-Dixon line. For decades before Lincoln's election, the southern states had been responsible for most of the federal government's revenue. The South had stringent tariffs forced upon it by northern lawmakers, who in turn gave about 80% of the funds to enhance public works in their states and bolster the struggling economy of the North. There was no income tax in the United States at that time, nor had there ever been an income tax, as it was forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. About 85% of the revenue that the federal government had at its disposal came from in the form of tariffs that it had levied on goods and services from the South. The high taxes that Southerners paid helped to build railroads, roads, manufacturing, and complexes and canals in the North. Before 1812, the tariffs levied were between 15 and 20%. The funds garnered by these tariffs were enough to keep the federal government fully functional without placing an excessive burden on any Pacific region of the country. When the War of 1812 broke out, the tariffs upon Southern businesses was increased up to 26% by Congress, with the net profits being funneled to aid manufacturers in the North. With a new tariff in 1828, the economy of South Carolina took the biggest hit and lost 20% of its export business in just 24 months. The Southern newspapers, the tariffs was nicknamed the tariff of oh my God, I'm having trouble reading. Abominations. I think that's what it is. The U.S. Congress was dominated by Whig Party members from the North, who had passed the tariff, increasing the amount that the South had to pay on exported goods up to 50%. In 1832, South Carolina officials called for a state convention to nullify both the tariff of 1822 and another tariff that had been enacted earlier that same year. By arguing that the tariffs were unconstitutional, unfair taxation was one of the premises that had sparked America's War of Independence against England, and it seemed as if the same issue were going to prompt a civil war in the still young nation. In early 1860, the Morrill Tariff was passed, even though the tariffs being collected from the South now totaled around 87% of the federal government's revenue. The bill was named after Northern steel manufacturer and Republican Congressman Justin Morrill. The legislation levied up to 47% tariff increase on exported goods over the course of 3 years. The burden on the new tariff fell squarely on the shoulders of the South. The industrial businesses of the North were largely domestic sellers. The Morrill tariff decreased the trade value of agriculture exports overseas, causing the gigantic blow to the Southern economy. Abraham Lincoln campaigned as a supporter of the tariff. Yep. Thaddeus Stevens, a Lincoln supporter and Republican congressman, co-authored the Morrill Tariff during the campaign season. The iron manufacturer from Pennsylvania said that the two most important issues of the 1860 election were increasing tariffs and putting an end to slavery. Stevens also told a New York crowd that the new tariff would financially cripple the South and the West, and it would enrich the North. He claimed that it would increase the wages of Northern industrial workers and help the American achieve greatness. Fuck you, Thaddeus Stevens. Henry Clay, who was the leader of the Whig Party, which held the majority in Congress, was able to implement an export tax of 36% in 1861. The economy of the North began to bloom because the bulk of the industrial goods were sold domestically, and the Southern economy began to downward spiral as the vast majority of its revenue was based upon the exportation of cotton and tobacco to Europe. Former President and South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun was able to negotiate a compromise that would roll back the tariffs to their former 15% range over the course of several years. Henry Clay, a man whom Lincoln greatly admired, and his Whig Party were infuriated at being forced into a compromise with the South. It meant the loss of money that was to be ultimately funneled, at least in part, to their campaign supporters. If Southern officials had tried to resist the tariffs, they would have been herded up and hanged as enemies of the state. Thaddeus Stevens was a powerful leader within the Republican Party, and by some accounts, he ran the nation after Lincoln's assassination. His open hostility towards the South and vindictiveness explains the North's punitive tone during the Reconstruction era. The 1860 presidential election. Lincoln won the 1860 election, but the why and how he had left out of history books, and this is causing a miseducation of millions of Americans. The Democratic Party split along geographical lines. During its presidential convention, a northern faction and a southern faction emerged. The convention ended without the nomination of a candidate to run on the ticket. When the Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina, to hold their convention in April, tensions swirled and boiled over rather quickly. Northern Party leaders felt that Stephen Douglas was their best chance to defeat the black Republicans, seeking to end or limit slavery. Southern Democrats largely deemed Douglas to be unfit because he believed that the federal government had no right to determine the legality of slavery. Douglas maintained that the issue should remain a state decision. 6 weeks before the Southern Democrats walked out of the convention without a vote being held, Steve Douglas was nominated during a second convention that was held in the North. Southern Democrats also held a second convention nominating the sitting Vice President John Breckinridge to lead the ticket. With the Democratic split in half and in chaos, Republicans felt that they would have an edge in the presidential race during their convention, which they held in Chicago. The following month, Republicans needed a candidate who would garner the electoral college votes of the North, which a scenario would require carrying Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Illinois, and Indiana. After intense debate over a slew of possible candidates, Abraham Lincoln, after 3 votes was taken, received the nomination during his one term in the Senate. The press had cast Lincoln as a strong all-American man with the inspiring young yourself up by the bootstring. Inspiring pulling yourself up by the bootstring story. He had become the darling of the North press during bitter debates with Stephen Douglas. Earlier the same year, news coverage of the debates was spread nationwide at the time when the telegraph was still in its infancy. When a three-way race for the presidency turned into a 4-man contest, Lincoln's party felt that their candidate would be a shoo-in. If given the right press coverage, John Bell, a wealthy Tennessee plantation owner, was nominated as the candidate for the newly created Constitutional Union Party. The political group was largely comprised of community pillars and former politicians. They described themselves as moderates. They believed that the best way to calm the nation and win the election was to avoid the issue of slavery altogether. As a presidential candidate, Lincoln supported the deportation of all Negroes to an unpopulated zone outside of America. This was oh my God, I'm not going to pronounce this word. I'm not even going to try. Described as a policy of colonization as late as December of 1862. Lincoln was continuing to promote his idea of ridding the U.S. mainland of all Negroes, even as the Civil War raged on. This stance, which was one that was taken by many of the most conservative members of his political party, did not endure him to either abolitionists or Southern voters. When Lincoln ran for the highest office in the land in 1860, it was the first time that secessional regional parties were involved in a political race. It was also the first time that the South was not represented on either the top or the bottom of a winning presidential ticket. Lincoln did not win a single electoral college vote from either a southern or border state. In fact, he won the election only with 39% of the popular vote. The message was clear to Southerns. The North, and only the North, would determine the president. Now, this is pretty messed up. Lincoln's early months in presidency. Southern perceived the election of Lincoln as the solidation of Northern dominance over nearly every aspect of their lives. It took only a day for Americans in South Carolina and multiple Gulf Coast states to call for secession. Despite the mounting tensions between the North and South, Lincoln did not have a single man who lived below the Mason-Dixon line on his cabinet as an advisor, nor did he take a meeting with any Southern lawmakers from the time he was elected up through in the beginning of the Civil War. If the perception of the Union was a top priority for Lincoln, preservation of the Union was a top priority for Lincoln, he should have attempted to prevent the mounting hostilities, addressed the concerns of the South had been battling against for more than a decade, and tried to prevent the fever pitch from growing louder. But he did not. Lincoln ignored the South economic and states' rights worries repeatedly, so their distrust of the new president increased drastically. Instead of attempting to meet with the Southerners to calm their fears over continued tariff increases or working towards eventually ending slavery peacefully, Lincoln signed the Morrill Tariff into law. Taking his power a step further, the new president vowed that he would ensure enforcement of the high tariffs on southern states that seceded from the United States. From the United States. It signaled to the southern states that they were trapped in a position of perpetual servitude to produce federal revenue. Yeah. You getting it, people? Are you getting what a tyrant he was? Lincoln was essentially calling the South out, but Southerners were not bluffing. They had lost patience in having taxation without representation for the sole benefit of the North. So they seceded, with South Carolina being the first state to exit the Union. Northern members of Congress began preparing for a military campaign as their Southern peers were packing up their Washington, D.C. offices for train rides home. James Buchanan, alongside other current and former politicians of the time, reached out to the South as well as the incoming administration to engage in a constitutional convention that was to be followed by a direct national vote on the divisive issues threatening to tear apart the country. It was a Kansas Senator, John Crittenden, not at Lincoln, who took bold steps to preserve the Union and prevent a civil war that would ultimately take more than 650,000 American lives. Modern history books ignore the Kansas Senator's noble efforts, as well as the decision by Lincoln and his party to embrace bloodshed. The Crittenden Compromise called for immediate legislation to create a far more permanent solution by way of constitutional amendments for the issues dividing the nation. The compromise called for extending the slavery border boundaries established by the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which had been terminated by the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was the North's provisional fig leaf, which was being offered to appease Southerners in the hopes that friendly relations would be renewed. The act which did get some support from powerful senators in the North, was sent to a special committee. However, it died when Some of Lincoln's most staunch supporters quickly cautioned Congress when presenting his bill. Is it to record that when the destruction of the Union was imminent, we stood quarreling? When elected officials from Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Missouri, Louisiana, and Florida received no communication from Lincoln to assure them that the fiscal attacks on the South would come to an end, they also voted to secede. North Carolina was the last state to leave, and it ultimately lost the most men to the war. Lincoln's War. Every newspaper in the country ran headlines about the South's secession. Neither the press nor the Northern public disputed the right of the states to legally and peacefully withdraw from the United States. At least not initially. When a member of Lincoln's cabinet suggested that they just let the South leave peacefully, the president has been quoted as replying, "Let the South go. Where then would we get our revenue?" Respect for the South's right to secede soon vanished, not because of a more in-depth look at our Constitution, but because wealthy Northern businesses leaders suddenly realized they would soon be competing in a truly free market, sans high tariffs against the South. In fact, on top of worries about the massive loss of annual revenues resulting from the lost tariffs, soon caused saber rattling of epic proportions. Lincoln finally took a meeting to convert one with a Southern. He met with Virginia Secession Convention delegate Colonel John Baldwin. The colonel, like many of his peers, preferred for his state to remain a part of the United States if a compromise could be reached. During the April 4th, 1861 meeting, Colonel Baldwin learned that the president was already plotting a military assault against the South at Fort Sumter. The Virginia delegate tried to convince Lincoln that any such action would force the Southern states into an all-out war with the North. The colonel also told the president that if the South were permitted to leave the Union peacefully, economic and historical ties would ultimately bring the two geographic factions back together again. Yep, if he had just stopped. Another point of fact that modern history books omit is why Fort Sumter was the place that Lincoln chose to make a stand. It was not merely a military fort. Fort Sumter was a tariff collecting facility. The president's attempts to terrorize the South into submission by assaulting the fort was an epic and very bloody failure. Colonel Baldwin responded to a letter that was sent by a Northern politician asking what would become of the Union when men in Virginia after the Battle of Fort Sumter. There are now no Union men in Virginia, but those who were Union men will stand to their arms and to make a fight which shall go down in history as an illustration of what a brave man can do in defense of their liberties. After having exhausted every means of pacification, after losing the early battles of the Civil War, Lincoln and his supporters, both in industry and the Senate, began to anguish over the possibility that England and European nations would send military support to the South, since his administration was viewed throughout the world as a despotic regime. Yep. There was concerns that the Republican leadership would be tried for like war criminals, threats, and a naval blockade ensued to preeminent. Oh, I'm having trouble pronouncing words. Preeminently thwart interventions by other nations. Lincoln even threatened war against any nation that sought to provide humanitarian aid. Author Charles Dickens penned a now obscure but relevant opinion piece about the Civil War in a London newspaper during the final weeks of 1861. The Northern onslaught upon slavery is no more than a piece of suspicious humbug disguised to conceal the desire for economic control of the United States. Yep, the infamous socialist Karl Marx also saw the Civil War for exactly what it was. He wrote, "The war between the North and South is a tariff war. The war is further not for any principle, does not touch the question of slavery, and in fact turns on the North lust for power." Did not know he said that. During his first 4 months as a president, Lincoln trampled the U.S. Constitution, created military dictatorship that was necessary to wage and win a war against his own people. Abraham Lincoln's unconstitutional acts and high crimes. 1. Lincoln circumvented Congress when calling up the U.S. Army, 75,000 men initially. He refused to call Congress back in session after ordering military action at Fort Sumter. Ordered the Navy to blockade the southern ports, a direct act of war. Such an act could not only be undertaken by an order of Congress, it was diabolical. It was a diabolical tactic to prevent food imports in order to starve the southern states. In an escalation of Lincoln's starvation strategy, he ordered General Sherman to build a military campaign against civilians. To begin, a military campaign against civilian cities and hospitals. Women, children were not spared. General Sherman was nicknamed Burning Sherman because he randomly burned entire cities, even in the middle of winter. Lincoln ordered Sherman to terrorize the South by pillaging and plundering at a level that surpassed even the ancient Roman armies. As America's first war criminal, General Sherman is one of the main reasons why disease and starvation killed significantly more people in the Civil War than combat. Suspended the writ of habeas corpus, yet another act that is function of Congress. The suspension of habeas corpus gave Lincoln the power to arrest Americans without filing a criminal charge and permitted him to have them held without either a charge or a trial. Lincoln violated the Constitution once again when he refused to comply with a Supreme Court order to immediately restore habeas corpus. Our founding fathers added the habeas corpus protection into the Constitution specifically so tyranny would never again reign in America. It had in Europe, and when the New World was under British control. Lincoln had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court arrested after receiving a court order to restore habeas corpus protections. Upon receiving the ruling by the High Court, the President sent a federal marshal to arrest the Chief Justice. There has never been a more substantial threat to the free press in the history of our country than the 16th president. Lincoln sent soldiers to destroy printing presses related to newspapers, publishing tools, at outlets which did not support his handling of the Southern secession. In response to negative editorials about the military invasion of the South, his overall war policy, Lincoln also commandeered and then closed 300 northern newspapers. Lincoln did not stop at just destroying private property and commandeering newspapers. He also arrested and imprisoned many of the editors, publishers, and those same press outlets. Before the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had ordered the arrest of approximately 20,000 Americans without charging them with a crime or permitting them to have their day in court. The citizens who were unconstitutionally detained had spoken out against Lincoln personally. The Civil War or were merely suspected of harboring anti-war sentiments. The 16th president illegally took it upon himself to create a new state, West Virginia. Quickly came into existence after Lincoln declared war on the South as a North-friendly regime within the South. Lincoln arrested and imprisoned the entire Maryland state legislature to prevent them from holding a debate and taking a vote on secession. The elected officials were never charged with a crime or granted a trial. Concluding the War of North Aggression, what occurred in 1861 still festers to this day, and almost all of it has been cloaked in politically expedient lies, a tyrannical, centralized government that was hell-bent on dominating the southern states was I'm having trouble pronouncing this word, by the election of Lincoln. Oh, I hate not being able to pronounce some words. What was known as the War of North Aggression throughout the world gave birth to the overbearing federal government that is answerable to no one. A false supremacy of federal government over the states. A government that cannot control its own growth of spending. The principle that agents of the federal government are above the law. A government that does not obey its own constitution and its bond a perceptional cycle of servitude for all Americans in the form of income tax. That national tax system requires the taxing of everything that every American does. They did it for the money, and it was only for the money. Northern troops were enraged, and their army began experiencing increased desertions. When in the middle of the war, the northern politicians reinvented the war as a crusade against slavery, the political capital as a means to further punish the South. Northern soldiers were deeply disturbed by this new narrative, which stated that they were expected to continue killing their own countrymen for the sole benefit of the Negroes. It was not what they had enlisted for. Meanwhile, many, if not most, of the freed slaves had to be driven from their plantations by Northern soldiers, for they were afraid to leave the only places they knew to be their homes. Most of the slaves had come to consider their owners as family, and this feeling was often mutual. Allowing the slaves to voluntarily remain looked terrible politically, and the press would have had a heyday if the overwhelming majority had remained. So slaves were driven into the wilderness with very few options for their survival other than crime. In response to the rampant crime by former slaves, who sadly had no other way to survive, the KKK was formed as a vigilant organization. Oh, really? But it quickly spiraled out of control with the growing racial tensions. At one point, this catastrophe was generally helping the colored as a goal of the North's war machine. America's founding fathers labored over what might be the most important document that will ever be written by man, only to be gutted less than 100 years later by a president who is falsely revered. Lincoln may have taken action that ultimately brought the broken Union back together, but the aftermath of his rule as a despot and a military dictator marks him as the worst enemy the United States has ever known. Lincoln came closer to completely destroying the United States than anyone else. The institution of slavery would have ended sooner with or without the war if Lincoln had chosen the without option, or if the South had been allowed to participate in the presidential election. Then America would not have had its culture economic basis obliterated. The U.S. would have advanced centuries beyond what it is now, and race relations would be good. Instead, most of America was sent back to the Stone Age, and the flames of racial hatred were fanned in a way that may never be truly quenched. Lincoln never expressed remorse for any of it. He was the very definition of a psychopath. He would be at home in today's liberal politics. The history of American Civil War ought to provide us with some important lessons, and it is easy to understand why the lessons are avoided by today's leftist educators. The American Civil War was a dire warning about the destiny of any welfare state. In the early stages of the disease, the U.S. political system was brought to its knees by class warfare. Eventually, as the class system ever polarized, one group became entirely responsible for financially supporting another. America became the first welfare state, with the South providing the welfare benefits to the North. The North was the South's ungrateful and jealous welfare child. Eventually, the North shifted from simply ingrateful to the full-fledged resentment against the hand that fed it. This irrational resentment is the eventual consequences of all welfare systems. Whenever they are continued for long enough, the situation to the North's jealousy and resentment was violence, which is justified through rationalizations of injustices by the very people whom it had developed a parasitic relationship with. Everything collapsed once the North ran out of other people's money. It had behaved as if there had been no need for thriftiness, since more money would always be taken. But there isn't always more. Compare this to the politics of today. Very little has actually changed between all the political correctness, socialist movement and race baiting and identity politics of liberalism today, we still find that we destroy the character and spirit of a people whenever we are too generous. Through our excesses, generosity, we encourage the beneficiaries of our philanthropy to develop a sense of entitlement and a belief in the righteousness of theft. Yeah. See, this is all one. You're seeing the Lincoln that, everybody else saw. And here's the Corwin. Yeah, this is the Corwin Amendment. He literally didn't want to end slavery. It wasn't about ending it. Literally, the original thing was the North could keep their slaves, South couldn't give up theirs. Lincoln even said that he was willing to let the South keep their slaves if they just didn't leave. And yet they still left. So fuck you on the slavery thing. Yeah, I've already talked about this. I just wanted to show you this is where you can find about the Corwin Amendment and Abraham Lincoln. He did not oppose slavery. Why did Lincoln issue because, like it said, he thought it would make this, would make the slaves in the South turn on the South, but instead what they found was, like I read, a lot of those slaves were actually freed and decided they considered their slave masters family. I showed you that. Yes, he exceeded his power. It was a total abuse of power. Here's the thing. Here's where it said where the founding the right to secede. The South had every right to leave the U.S. This is the original the states that seceded. How can the federal government be prevented from usurping power that the Constitution does not grant it? It's an alarming fact that few Americans ask the question anymore. Our ultimate defense against the federal government is the right of secession. Yes, most people assume that the Civil War settled that, but superior force proves nothing. If there was a right of secession before the war, it should be just as valid now. It wasn't negated because the North munition factories were more efficient than Southern ones. Among the founding fathers, there was no doubt the United States had just seceded from the British Empire, exercising the right of the people to alter or abolish by force, if necessary, a despotic government. The Declaration of Independence is the most famous act of secession in our history. Though modern rhetoric makes secession sound somehow different from and more sinister than claiming independence, the original 13 states formed a confederation under which each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. The Constitution did not change this. Each sovereign state was free to reject the Constitution. The new powers of the federal government were granted and delegated by the states, which implied that the states were prior and superior to the federal. Yes, they were. Even in the Federalist, the brilliant propaganda papers for ratification of the Constitution, largely written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the United States are constantly referred to as the Confederacy, and a confiscated republic, as opposed to a single consolidated or monolithic state. Members of a confederacy are defined free to withdraw from it. Hamilton and Madison hoped secession would never happen, but they never denied that it was a right and a practical possibility. They envisioned that people taking arms against the federal government, if it exceeded its delegated powers or invaded their rights, and they admitted that this would be justified. Secession, including the resort to arms, was the final remedy against tyranny. This is the real point of the Second Amendment. Yep. Strictly speaking, the states would not be rebelling since they were sovereign. In the framers' view, a tyrannical government would be rebelling against the states and the people, who by defending themselves would merely exercise the paramount political principle of self-preservation. The Constitution itself is silent on the subject, but since secession was an established right, it didn't have to be reaffirmed. More telling still, even the bitterest opponents of the Constitution never accused it of denying the rights of secession. 3 states ratified the Constitution with the provision that they could later secede if they choose. The other 10 states accepted the condition as valid. Early in the 19th century, some Northern favored secession to spare their states oh my God, I am really having trouble with words. Of union with the slave states. Later, others who wanted to remain in the Union recognized the rights of the South secede. Lincoln had many of them arrested as traitors. According to his ideology, an entire state could be guilty of treason and rebellion. The Constitution recognized no such possibility. Long before he ran as president, Lincoln had twice affirmed the right of secession, even armed revolution. His scruples changed when he came to power. Only a few weeks after taking office, he wrote an order for the arrest of Chief Justice Roger Taney, who had attacked his unconstitutional suspension of habeas corpus. His most recent biographer has said that during Lincoln's administration, there were greater infringements on individual liberties than in any period. Yes. As a practical matter, the Civil War established the supremacy of the federal government over the formerly sovereign states. The states lost any power of resisting the federal government's usurpation, and the long decline towards a totally consolidated central government began. Yeah. By 1973, the federal government was so powerful that the U.S. Supreme Court could insult the Constitution by striking down the abortion laws of all 50 states, and there was nothing the states long since robbed of the right to secede could do about it. That outrage was made possible by Lincoln's triumphant war against the states, which was really his dark victory over the Constitution he was sworn to preserve. Yeah. Are you getting it, people? This monster, Lincoln, I've read you the shit. What a monster he was. I've told you he was not the hero. All your schools tell you. You want to see the war crimes? Here it is. Here are the war crimes. Yeah, I mean, this is at Powell Books. Whoops, sorry. Yeah. But yeah, this is your Lincoln. Sorry about that. This was the tyrant that history books try to play he was a great man. He was such a great man. He started a war to take away states' rights. Slavery was not the reason the South seceded. No, it wasn't. South seceded because of Lincoln. So I wanted to do this to show you what a monster Lincoln really was. You've all been duped into believing Lincoln was this great man who could do no wrong, and yet look at him. He did terrible things. So yeah, I wanted to cover this so that you could see that we've all been lied to. And that the reason South seceded was because of taxes, not because of slavery. And even Lincoln didn't oppose the Indian slavery, like right here. The Corwin Amendment and enslavement and Abraham Lincoln. I'll read it to you. The Corwin Amendment, also called the Slavery Amendment, was a constitutional amendment passed by Congress in 1861, but never ratified by the states, that would have banned the federal government from abolishing the institution of slavery in the states where it existed at the time, considering it a last-ditch effort to prevent the looming Civil War. Supporters of Corwin's amendment hoped it would prevent the southern states that had not already done so from seceding from the Union. Ironically, Abraham Lincoln did not oppose the measure. Yeah, the key takeaways. The Corwin Amendment was a proposed amendment to the Constitution passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification in 1861. The amendment was conceived by outgoing President James Buchanan as a way to prevent the Civil War. Had it been ratified, the Corwin Amendment would have prohibited the federal government from abolishing enslavement in the states where it existed at the time. While not technically endorsing the Corwin Amendment, Lincoln did not oppose it. Prematurely labeled as the 13th Amendment, the Corwin Amendment was one of the 3 attempts to resolve secession crisis between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. The Crittenden Plan and the Washington Peace Convention had been rejected by Republicans who felt it yielded too much to the enslavement interests and snubbed the central plank of the Republican platform, which opposed the extension of enslavement. The text of the Corwin Amendment. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give the Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institution thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. In referring to enslavement as domestic institutions and peoples held to labor or service rather than by the specific word slavery, the amendment reflects wording in the draft of the Constitution considered by the delegates to be Constitutional Convention of 1787, which referred to enslaved people as persons held to service. The legislative history of the Corwin Amendment. When Republican Lincoln, who had opposed expanding the practice of enslavement during the campaign, was elected president in 1860, the pro-slavery South states started withdrawing from the Union during the 16th weeks between Lincoln's election, November 6, 1860, and his inauguration, March 4th, 1861. 7 states, led by South Carolina, seceded, formed the independent Confederate States of America. While still in office until Lincoln's inauguration, Democratic President James Buchanan declared secession to be a constitutional crisis and asked Congress to come up with a way to reassure the southern states that the incoming Republican administration under Lincoln would not outlaw enslavement. But it was never this is what the Corbin, specifically Buchanan asked Congress for an explanatory amendment to the Constitution that would clearly confirm the rights of the states to allow enslavement. A 3-member committee of the House of Representatives, headed by Representative Thomas Corwin of Ohio, got to work on the task. After considering and rejecting 57 drafts, resolutions introduced by a host of representatives, the House approved Corwin's version of the Enslavement Protecting Amendment on February 28, 1861, by a vote of 133 to 65. The Senate passed the resolution on March 2nd, 1861, by a vote of 24 to 12. Since proposed constitutional amendment require a 2/3 support vote for passage, 103 were required for the House and 24 votes in the Senate, having already announced their intent to secede the Union. Representative of the 7 pro-slave states refused to vote on because it was never about slavery. Presidential reaction to the Corwin. Outgoing President James Buchanan took the unprecedented and unnecessary step of signing the Corwin Amendment resolution while the president had no formal role in the constitutional amendment process, and his or her signature is not required on joint resolution as it is on most bills passed by Congress. Buchanan felt his action would show his support for the amendment and help convince the southern states to ratify it. While philosophically opposed to enslavement itself, President Lincoln still hoped to avert war, did not object to the Corwin Amendment, stopped short of actually endorsing it. Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, I understand, okay, but yeah, because it wasn't about slavery. Understand it. When you look at this right here, like I said, from the Trenches of the World Report, the terrible truth about Lincoln, you know that this was never about slavery. To Lincoln, to the North, they tried to make it about slavery, but it really was about being taxed without representation, just like what created our Revolutionary War. So yeah, they want to tell you this was about the slavery. It really wasn't. I've read to you the truth about Lincoln. This is, I don't know what else to show you. I've read exactly the crimes he committed. I've read a bunch of this stuff off to you. You can look this stuff up for yourself. I want to thank you all for tuning in for this, and have a great day.